So the first thing that I want to do is I just want to do a bit of setup for our material here. So if you want to skip this and get right into the material, just take a look in the description below and I'll have a timestamp for you. So first things first, I just went up to File here. I clicked on New Substance. We want to make sure that we are physically based in the metallic roughness. And then I just named my graph to Muddy Tracks Tutorial. So the first thing that I want to do is create a base material node. And we're going to use this to visualize our material on our mesh here. So when I right click on this guy and click View in 3D, we're going to get this node as basically a representation of our outputs here. So for the first little bit, we can just disregard those nodes. And if I come over to the right side here, we've got some parameters that we can play around with. And so the first thing I want to do is go to our material preset, and I just want to set it to a dielectric material. We can also come down to our user defined maps, and I just want to expose our normal and our height. So now that we've got these inputs exposed, I can start by adding some of our atomic nodes here. So I'm going to add a normal map, or a normal mode, and I'm just going to plug that guy in. And so now we should be good to start creating our material. So if we think about the way that our material is going to be constructed, we try and think about kind of the top to bottom. What is going to be the base of what we're creating? And in this particular case, we're going to be creating the mud. So to start off, we want to create a Clouds 2 node. And this is going to give us the base kind of height information that we're going to use for our mud material here. So we can plug this guy into our normals and plug this guy into our height. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to come up to our 3D view here and click on Materials. We want to go to Default and Edit. And we just want to make sure that we turn our scale in our tab here all the way up. And what that's going to do is show us our parallax occlusion height mapping in our 3D view here. So you can see when I bring this guy up, it starts to bring the normals of our geometry down into the mesh here. And this just helps us visualize what our height information is going to be doing on our material. So I'm going to go to our normal map, and I'm just going to bump this up to something around 4 so that we get more definition on our actual geometry here. And now looking at the geometry here, I noticed that it looks just a little too sharp for what we want our mud to look like. So in order to fix that up and make it a little bit wavier and a little bit smoother, I'm going to use a directional warp. So I'm going to drag this guy back, and over top I'm going to add a directional warp. And in the intensity input here, I'm just going to take this guy and plug him in as well. So now if we take a look at the warp here, it's not doing too much. But if I bump this up to something like 50, you can see now the kind of effect that it's going to take. And if we change the warp angle, it's just going to rotate around the effect. So playing around with this, I found something closer to the effect of 35 and around 85 degrees to be something that kind of gets the look that we're going for here. And now the last thing that I want to do is I want to add a histogram range just going in towards our height. And what a histogram range will do is allow us to have both the range and position parameters to switch around to kind of give us more control of what we're going to do with our height. So if you take a look here, we can increase the range between the darker and the lighter values, or decrease them, giving us a less contrasted range to work with here meaning that our height is going to be relatively similar across the uniform object or material. So we bring this back up to 0.5. You can also raise all of the values uniformly together by switching the position slider down here. If we bring this down, it makes the entire texture set darker, and if we bring it all the way up, you can see that it uniformly makes everything much brighter in value. We'll put that back down to 0.5 for now, and this will be much handier as we work towards the end of our chain and towards the end of our material, and just give us more control over what our height and our ambient occlusion are going to be doing once we progress farther on the look that we want to go for. So now that we've created the base geometry for our mud, I want to go about creating the tire tracks for on top of our base material there, or our base geometry. Now I don't want to create the tire treads just yet, but I actually want to create just the initial base geometry for the tire tracks. And you'll see what I mean in just a second here. So up top over here, I'm just going to add a gradient linear 2. And I'm going to come down into the parameters, and I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees, just so that we get our tracks going up and down. And this is just a little bit easier for me to read. So when we come down here to tiling, you can see that we're going to get the material tiling seamlessly across the entire texture set, and we don't really want that. So if I bring this down to 2, and I come up to our tiling mode, I'm going to come down to absolute, and I just want to make sure that we click vertical tiling. And now it's only going to tile it across the vertical axis here. So we can make it as skinny or as thick as we want. So I'm going to leave it at 2. And I'm going to run this guy here through a curve node. And what the curve node is for is basically just to remap the gradient that we get from our first node here. And you can see if I just double click on our line here, we can start to play around with some of the values that we get. We can make it drop off very soon. We can make it a little bit more of a rounded top. And if we play around with our handles here, you can really give the gradient any effect that you want. You can even affect each end of your scale here to make things sharp, to even make the center of our gradient, the whiter values, darker. And I'm going to leave that about there. And I'm going to just bring this guy down so that we get just a bit of a rounded fall off, but a pretty consistent color. The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we get 2 of our tracks. So I'm going to run this guy through a tile generator node. Making sure that we plug this guy into our top pattern and removing it from the background there. And now I want to come down to where it says pattern, and I want to make sure that this guy is just set to image input, so that we're going to use the actual pattern that we've input into our tile generator here. So now I'm going to bring the Y amount down to 1, so it's just going to take this here and stretch it vertically. And I also want to make sure that we only have 2 tracks on the x-axis. So if I bring this guy down to 2, now you're going to see that we're going to get just the basis of our 2 tire tracks. So now I want to add our base tire marks here on top of our mud geometry. So I'm going to just create a blend, and I'm going to make sure to plug in our mud on the bottom here and plug in our tile generator on the top. So now I just want to make sure that I plug in our normal map and our histogram range separately so that the height is independent of the normal map. So now with our blend here, I just want to go and change the blending mode over to multiply, and you can see that we run into an issue where our blend here is only going to take the lighter values of our top map and basically just eliminate those but keep the darker values. And so what we need to do to our tile generator here is we need to add a levels node, and we're going to flip the inputs of the channels. And as soon as we do that, you can see that we get this nice two tire tracks running right down the center of our mud geometry. And you still get a little bit of the mud normal map and the height map coming through. And this is why we added a curvature node, to get a nice little lip right with our tires, but also to decrease the value so that when we multiply, we still get a little bit of geometry and a little bit of the normal map coming through. And now I want to go about creating the actual geometry for the tire treads. And so to do that, I'm going to create a Fibers 2 node, and I'm going to create a blend just on our curve node down here. So I'm going to plug in our fibers over top of our blend here, and I want to just take our curve node here and I want to plug that down into the opacity of our blend. So now you can see that we're only getting our fiber to show up where our actual curve is going to show. And you can see with our tile generator, it's just going to duplicate this geometry over to our second tire tread. So now I can go about creating the actual treading itself. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take our fibers and I just want to kind of tile it up a little bit to something around 4. And you can see that doesn't really look anything actually like tire treads, but bear with me. So we're going to keep on our fibers and we're going to add a mirror grayscale. And what this is going to do is it's going to cut down the center of our texture here and it's just going to mirror it over. Now I want to come down to our mode and I just want to mirror corner. So now it's going to mirror in quadrants. So we can leave the corner type as it's just going to switch around where it's actually mirroring from. So we can leave it at top left. And hopefully you can start to see a little bit of a tire tread that we're going to get. But I want to add a safe transform just before we do the final touches. And what we want to do is we want to take our texture and we just want to rotate it 90 degrees. So if I come down to our rotation with our safe transform on, I just type in 90, and now we're starting to get something that kind of looks like tire treads. So the last thing that we want to add on our little daisy chain here is we want to add an edge detect node. And what this is going to do is just find all of the edges or the very contrasting values in our fibers here, and it's just going to make it a binary white and black map. Now if we decrease the edge width as well as the edge roundness, and then we come and bump up the tolerance just to something like 0.2, we start to get something that greatly resembles a tire tread. And if we look at our blend here, you can see that we've actually just created a tire tread over top of our tire marks that we carved out of our mud geometry here. And as we run along our little chain that we've set up, we've duplicated these threads inverted them so that when we multiply over top, we're going to get rid of just the background white of our tire treads here, and we're just going to get a nice little recess into our mud. So after we've added the tire threads, you can see that there's not as much detail from the underlying mud material here. And so in order to fix that, we just come up to our levels node here, and we're just going to decrease, or I guess bump up, the black levels output. And this is going to affect how deep our recess is, but also how much of the underlying detail is visible. So I'm going to bring these guys back, because the next thing we want to do is we want to simulate the mud that would have been pushed off to the side by the tire tracks here. And so what we're going to do is we're first going to create a shape node, and we're just going to leave it on the initial square, and we're going to actually make a rectangle that's just kind of skinny right in the middle of our texture here. So I'm going to bring the X value down to something like 0.1. And now I'm going to mirror it so that we actually get a duplicate, so that we're able to just control one but duplicate it on both sides of our track here. So if I add a mirror grayscale, you can see that not much has happened, and that's because it's actually mirroring over top of itself. So we should add a safe transform, and if we come down to our offset and we start to slide up our X, you can see when we visualize our grayscale here, or our mirror, we get a duplicate of the shape that we've created. Off of this grayscale here, I'm just going to add a slope blur grayscale, and this is going to affect the edges of our grayscale here and just kind of warp it around and give it some interesting and more organic geometry. So on top of this guy, I'm just going to add another Gaussian noise. I'm going to plug this in, and you can see that it's going to give us a very complex and kind of stupid looking result. And that's perfectly alright. We just want to bump up our samples over here, and we want to decrease the intensity drastically. We can also decrease the scale of it to give us a little bit of a smoother transition as opposed to very jaggedy. I'll bump it down to something like 15, we'll say. And now I just want to affect it a little bit more, so I'm going to run it through a warp just to add more variety and more organicness to it. And I'm going to take the same Gaussian and plug that guy in. And now if we just play around with the intensity, you can get some interesting looking results. So I'm going to put that to about 0.5. And lastly, I just want to run this guy through a blur node. And this is just going to add a little bit more of a gradient as opposed to a sharper contrast, because when we tile it over our road texture here, or our threads, we want it to kind of gradually run up, like it's just been a mound of dirt pushed over, as opposed to just a straight up and then our material. So when we add a blur, we just get a little bit more of a gradiated effect to our material or our texture here. And from here, I want to start adding a little bit of our noise detail onto our kind of pushed off to the side mud. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a black and white spots 3 node just to give us a little bit of variety and a little bit of larger protrusions as well. And I'm going to run this through a blend. And if I bring this guy in over top, I'm going to use our blur as our opacity meter as well. And you can see that as we run off, we get a little bit less, but on top we get a lot of our noise detail here. And this is starting to look perfect for what I want to have just on the sides of our tire tracks. But now we need to tile it so that we have 2 here as well as 2 for our other tire thread. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to just go over to where we have our first tile generator, and I'm going to just Control D to duplicate it. And so when I bring it over here, and I'll plug this guy in instead so that we get all of the same parameters as we did for the other tire threads, and that we just don't have to go and fix all the parameters again. So if I bring all of these guys back and I add a blend node over top of our chain here, I'm going to bring this guy in and just put him over top. And now there's a bunch of different ways that we could go about trying to mask off our nice gradients here. But the nicest way that I've found is if we just go to our blending mode and we just switch it to screen. And that's just going to eliminate all of the black from our texture here, or the darker values, and it's going to just keep some of the lighter values because we do want our material to kind of increase in elevation a little bit, so we want to keep some of the lighter values. So now you can see though that we get a little bit of overlap on top of our texture here between our tire threads and our little bumps. And if we take a look at our texture here, you can see that that is in fact the case. So what we can do is we just come back to our safe transform where we've just pushed it off to the side, and we can just play around with moving and switching around the mirroring. And now that's looking a little bit better as things line up and they don't overlap each other. So now that we've created the base figure for the sides of our treads here, I want to go ahead and just kind of add a little bit more geometry running through it to make it look like it's a little bit of dried and cracked mud. So I'm going to come down here and find some extra space. And I'm going to add a cells 2 node. And I like to use a cells 2 just because we can play around with the edge width to make thicker or thinner lines depending on whatever fits our need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down the scale a little bit, and I'm just going to plug in a flood fill node. And what this is going to allow us to do is use any one of these flood fill options, because it's going to take each one of these individual cells and we're going to be able to apply gradients to each one of these individually. So from here I'm going to take a flood fill gradient, and I'm going to come down to our angle variation, and I'm just going to crank that up a fair bit to switch around and randomize the angles. As well, you can turn this around to fit something that, or find something that fits more of your need. And we'll leave that for now. Continuing along, I want to kind of warp and bend these to just make them look more organic. So I'm going to just add in a warp. And I'm going to do a purlin noise this time, just to switch things up. So now looking at this guy, we just want to bring the intensity down. Maybe bring the scale down as well. And something like that looks pretty good. From there, I just want to add a slope blur grayscale because I want to start chipping away at the edges and making some more different looking geometry and make the edges split a little bit more so that it's not all uniformly shape and then edge. So for that, I'm going to add a fractal sum base. And again, we want to just increase the samples and we want to bring down the intensity. Now that's a little bit too noisy, so let's go into our fractal sum here and let's just kind of play around with some of the parameters. So if we double click on our slope to view and then single click on our fractal sum, you can see the different effects that we're getting from playing around with these parameters. And something like this kind of gives me the effect that we're going for, where we have a little bit of edge divots kind of sinking into each of the cells here, and it's just giving a little bit of an eroding effect. The last thing I want to do is I just want to run this all through another blur because I don't want to have such sharp contrasting changes in our height or our normal. So I just want to smooth things out just a little bit. So we can do 0.25. And now I want to combine both our edges here with our geometry. And so from here I'm going to add a blend, and I'm going to make sure that this guy is actually in the background and we have our cells over top. I'll plug this guy in here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch our blending mode over to soft light, and this is just going to put everything kind of over top of our geometry for our sides of our road here, or our threads. And this is just going to add a cracking effect along the road to make it look a little bit, sun-dried or sun-worn. And we can come back and play with the size of our cells as well by scaling up. And that's looking pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add a bunch of rocks that have just been thrown around our material here. And to do that, it's going to be very simple. The first thing we want to add is a shape node. And we're going to switch this guy from a square and bring him over to a paraboloid. And this is going to be the base shape of what our rocks are going to look like. And so we're going to run this guy through a warp node. And we're going to add a purlin noise to be our gradient input. And so immediately off the bat, like normal, it doesn't look too good. But if we just decrease the intensity a little bit and we play around with the scale, we're going to get something a little bit nicer. So play around with a 9. And maybe bring this up to 3 just to get some crazy intensity going. And bring the intensity back near the scale, sorry. And something like that should be okay. I also just want to bring down the scale of our rock just a little bit so that it's not clipping across or off the texture set there. So now let's bring this into a tile generator, and we're just going to kind of throw it around, make it all random like. So we're going to go to image input for our pattern, and we're just going to start by kind of making them a little bit random. So we're going to do some rotation random off the bat, and again we're going to play around with it a little bit as we make our way down. We also want to randomize the scale a little bit just to make sure that not all the rocks look like they're just the same rocks stamped across our material here. Also playing around with the offset and the offset random. And here is where we get to play around with the different, the random X and Y values. And so if we just play around with this, you can see that it's starting to throw the rocks in very non-uniform ways. You can also play around with the global offsets to randomize even more. And here's where we get the rotation of our rocks. So this turns them all uniformly, and we can also, again, randomly rotate them on their own axis. Down here with color, we can change the luminance values, which basically just changes the color value of each rock. And this will add a little bit more variety as well to our rocks here. We can also click on luminance by scale, and it will actually bring the volume or the value down for the smaller rocks. So as the scale of a rock decreases, so does the value, meaning the smaller rocks get darker. So I'm going to leave that checked as false just for now. We can also randomly mask off a little bit just to make it look as though it's not just a uniform kind of grid for rocks. It just adds more to the organicness and the variety of it. Down here with the blending mode as well, you can see that when rocks intersect with each other, they become almost pure white. And we don't really want that, especially for our height and our normal, because a pure white is going to be a flat surface. So we want to come into here and we want to change this to max. And now the rocks are going to kind of intersect with each other and form a larger rock, or give it a cracking effect. So now that we've kind of got these values all changed, I'm going to go back up to the top. I'm going to play around with just adding a lot more rocks to make them look a little bit smaller and more pebble-like. So I'm going to bring this guy back here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a height blend node. And so I'm going to plug these rocks into our top height map, and I'm going to plug this guy into our bottom here. And you can see it's kind of overlaying our height map over top of each other, and we get some parameters down here to play around with the offset. So it's a much more organic way for our blending of height maps. And you can see as we decrease the height offset, the rocks kind of blend and fade away and sink into our height map below, which is our mud. So I'm going to plug this guy into our normals and our height here. And you can see once we start playing around with the offset, it's almost as if the rocks kind of sink and disappear into the material. Now we also get a mask, which we are going to use because we don't really want all of our rocks in our track area, because realistically they would have been either pushed off to the side or squished down into the mud. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to come back here and I'm going to grab, when we inverted the levels, the last node in our kind of grouping here. And so I'm going to bring that guy and I'm going to plug him in just into the mask. And you can see what that's done is it's created a bit of a darker value for these rocks to make them look like they've been pressed in to the mud. And now there's two things that you can do. You can either add a levels node to this guy here and completely remove these rocks, or you can keep the value that you have now as a darker value and just adds a little bit more of a subtle effect to the underlying detail of our mud here. So now we're done our base geometry for pretty much our entire material here. So I'm just going to get rid of our base material, and I'm going to start plugging things into their appropriate output. So I'm just going to put the normal up here, and I'm going to put the height down here. Now the one thing I want to do to kind of help us visualize the rest of our material is I'm going to add an ambient occlusion output. So I'm going to come down below the height, and I'm just going to type output. So with this guy, I'm just going to add an item and go and find our ambient occlusion. I just want to make sure that I type things accordingly as well, and call this ambient occlusion. Lastly, I want to make sure that we put this in the material group in case we want to use this for future materials. So I'm going to plug in our histogram range here that we've been using directly into our ambient occlusion. And on top of that, I'm going to add an ambient occlusion node. And the reason that I use the histogram is because whenever we're changing the height or the range values for our material, it's going to directly affect the ambient occlusion and the shadow information that we're going to get from that. So now that we've done that, I just want to right click and click View Outputs in 3D. And so now we're going to get a nice black and shiny material. And that's because we don't have anything in our base color or our roughness. So for our roughness, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a curvature smooth node, and I'm going to plug our normal map into that because we're going to get a lot of edge geometry and edge detail from our normal map. And if we take a look, you can see that we're going to get a lot of that information. So when I plug this guy in, we're going to get a little bit more of a realistic looking reflection. Now the issue with that is that we're using a roughness map, and on a roughness map, white indicates rougher materials. Inversely, the darker values mean that it's going to be highly glossy or highly shiny. And you can see in here, in the cracks, we get a lot of shine where realistically we would not get. So we're going to add on top of our curvature smooth a levels node, and we're just going to invert both of our inputs here. And now we get something that's a little bit more true to form. So the next thing I want to do is I really want to take a look at our albedo or base color, because we have a lot of components that make up our material, and we want to go about creating each albedo map kind of separately and then combining them all together as we go. So the first one I want to create is just based off of our height information here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy and just plug him directly into our base color output so we can see what we're working with. So you can see that the higher up values or the higher elevated values are white, and as we recess into the back we get darker values closer to black. And that is just what method we use for creating our height map here. On top of this guy, I'm just going to add a gradient map. And I'm going to come over here to our gradient editor, and when I click over here we're going to get both a black and white value. And this kind of works almost like a levels node would, where it's just a spectrum of colors denoted to our darker values being on the left side and our brighter values being on the right side. So if I click on this little node here and I start clicking in our color wheel, you can see that it's going to correspond to the values in the brighter end of the spectrum. And if I bring this down, it's going to affect more and more of the brighter values to the point where it no longer shows up with any darker values because it's greatly overpowered most of our spectrum here. And you can see if we take a look, there's just a tiny little bit in the darker end of the spectrum. And so if I bring this back up and I click on this guy here, and I just want to make him a little bit of a darker brown, and this is just going to be our base coating to kind of give a little bit of indication of what's going on in our material. The next thing I want to do is I want to go about adding some more variety to the sides of our treads here, where we've indicated that it's a little bit drier and a little bit brighter in color because of its dried cracking nature. So I'm going to come back to where we've got our tile generator here for both of our sides of our road sides, and I'm going to just add another gradient map, which I'm going to plug into, and I'm going to do the same thing with the roadsides here that I did with the initial gradient map. And what I'm going to do is just kind of add a base color that we can kind of branch off from. And again, I want to make sure that these are a little bit brighter because it is dried mud. And so now that I've got that, I'm just going to add a blend between the two. And you can see now what it's affecting. But now I need to make sure that we kind of eliminate the background here so that we get to see all of the information that we've created over here. And in order to do that, I'm just going to, again, take this guy here and plug him into the opacity of our material. And so now you can see the effect that we're going to get here. If you want, you can also add a levels node onto your opacity just to play around more and have more control over the values that you're seeing in your material. If you wanted a greater fade, you can really increase the black values of your mask and even play around with the output values of the levels. Now I want to go about creating some color for our rocks, because especially in this area, some of the rocks would have exposed faces. So just like we did for this guy here, I want to find where we've tiled all of our rocks, and I want to go and create its own gradient map. So I'm going to add a gradient map. And I'm going to go into the gradient editor. And here I'm just going to go into kind of the blue grayish area, and I'm going to just play around with a little bit of color values here. And again, the closer you are, the more exposed to the top, so we have a little bit of a brighter value. And down at the very bottom, because we're in mud, I kind of want to have a little bit of that color seeping up the rocks. So now if we add a blend to our chain here, and doing the same thing that we did for our roadsides, we just take this guy here and we add another levels node on top so that we get more control over where the masking is occurring. And so now we're getting some of those values showing through, but I feel like they're a little too bright. So I'm just going to decrease these values a little bit. And I might even just get rid of some of these values. So the last albedo or gradient that I want to do is I just want to go back to the very start where we had our initial mud here, and I want to just colorize this to kind of put it over top and blend some more things together. So I'm going to add a gradient map and plug this guy right into there. I'm going to bring him right over to where we've got our albedo. And now I'm going to start playing around with these values. So again, just doing what we've done for everything else. I'm just going to add some lighter and darker values, playing around and just trying to break things up a little bit. And so with that, I'm going to add one more blend, and I'm going to bring this guy over top. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with the blending modes to see if there's any that really stick out to me. And I kind of like the max lighten because it adds a little bit of saturation and gives you very visible layers to your material here. But I also want to bring down the opacity because I don't want to destroy all of the work I've done previously. And so if we take a look, you can see that it just adds a little bit more of a variety to our material here. Just a little bit more color information. Finally, I just want to add a sharpen node to the very end of our material here. Even though it is mud and it is relatively blurry and fuzzy, we do want to have a little bit of sharpness just to add a little bit more definition to our material. And normally I leave it at around 1 because 1 really defines the shapes but doesn't over distort things like you can see here. So I'm putting this back to 1. And that's looking pretty good for our albedo. And now the last thing I want to do is I want to come down to our metallic. And even though we've got no metallic objects in our material here, we still need to provide an output for it. And so if I come up to our atomic nodes here and I just click on color, we're going to create a uniform color node that we're going to plug in. We're going to come over to grayscale because we want to use as little information for this node as we can because it's only providing a solid color. We also want to come up to our output size here and we want to click on absolute. And we're just going to bring it down to 4 by 4 or 16 pixels by 16 pixels. And so for that, this is going to give us the lowest possible draw call time for this resource because it's only going to give us a solid black color. However, for game engines like Unity that uses the metallic channel for its smoothness, we don't want the smoothest map to be 16 by 16 pixels because that's going to give us very poor quality results. So we're going to add a levels node on top of this. And we don't need to change any parameters except up at our output size. And we're going to check off relative to parent. So whatever texture size we determine our entire material to be, our roughness map is going to be that exact same size. And so we can just condense these guys here. And this is our Muddy Tracks material.